A dog's bark tore through the heavy summer night, followed by the thunder of paws pounding across the stone path. A large, dark figure bolted through the backyard, clenching something tiny and helpless between its jaws. It was Max, the German shepherd Sarah Miller had trusted enough to bring home just 3 weeks ago, and dangling from his massive mouth, bathed in the yellow porch light, was Sophie, the baby girl she and Mark had fought nearly 3 exhausting years of treatments to finally have. That night, at 2:00 a.m., Sarah jolted awake at the sound of the back door slamming against the wall. One glance at the empty crib froze her blood in her veins. By the time she stumbled outside, barefoot and shaking, she saw a nightmare no mother should ever face. Max, carrying her child, running straight toward the dark tree line at the edge of their yard. A cold terror tangled with rage burning away every rational thought. Sarah screamed his name, her feet raw against the stones as she sprinted after the black blur. In her mind, one question clawed at every fragile piece of trust she had left. Why did I ever bring a stranger dog here? How could I hand my only child to him? Sophie was a miracle that had arrived late to the Miller family, a fragile blessing they had prayed for, paid for, and wept for. Now, in the jaws of an animal scarred by a violent past, Sarah felt that miracle tearing apart, and she would give anything, break any promise, to pull her daughter back into her arms, even if she had been the one who opened the door and let this danger in. Before that haunting night, the Miller family truly believed they were living in the simple dream life anyone would envy. Sarah loved her job as a kindergarten teacher at a small school nearby. Each day, she crafted fairy tales for the children, taught them to fold paper swans, sing nursery rhymes, and believe in the goodness of the world. Mark, her husband, worked as a freelance graphic designer, often tucked away in his tiny office next to the kitchen, listening to Sophie babble in the living room as he sketched logos and posters. Sophie was the late blessing they had almost given up on. 3 years of treatments, countless disappointments, and then, finally, the first cry that made both Sarah and Mark believe in miracles again. From that moment on, Sarah's heart brimmed with the need to give Sophie a childhood rich in both comfort and love. One quiet night after tucking Sophie into her crib, Sarah confessed to Mark her wish to bring a dog into their family. Not a puppy from a breeder, but a dog who needed to be saved. "I want Sophie to grow up knowing how to share, to care, to love something fragile," she whispered, running her fingers through Mark's hair, picturing their little girl laughing on the lawn with a gentle friend by her side. Mark hesitated. How could he not worry with all the horror stories of dogs biting children, especially a dog with a bruised past? No one could guarantee its mind was sound. But one look at Sarah's determined eyes left him sighing, defeated. "I trust you, but we'll choose carefully." So for nearly a month, every weekend, they strapped Sophie into her car seat and drove all over Asheville, visiting every rescue shelter they could find. They walked past rows of barking dogs, eyes wild with fear or aggression, matted fur, old wounds that hadn't healed. More than once, Mark nearly called it quits, but Sarah never did. And then they saw Max, a large German shepherd with dark, rough fur and eyes that were strangely quiet. He didn't bark, didn't lunge at the fence like the others. He just sat there, ears drooping slightly, staring straight at Sarah as if asking, "Do you have the patience to trust me?" The shelter worker told them Max had once guarded a lumber yard. His previous owner had beaten him, trying to train him to attack intruders. But Max had never fought back. He just starved himself and curled into corners. When they rescued him, he was all bones and scars. They weren't sure if he would ever fit into a family or if he could leave that past behind. Sarah didn't say much. She simply knelt by the wire fence and stretched out her hand. Max slowly stepped forward, not wagging his tail, not licking her fingers like the other dogs. He just placed one giant paw against the wire, locking eyes with her. A promise, silent but certain. And in that moment, Sarah knew she would bring him home. Max arrived at the Miller home on a quiet, crystal-clear afternoon. Sunlight streamed through the trees, scattering dappled patches across the wooden porch. There was no excited barking, no chaotic welcome that usually came with bringing a new dog home. Max simply crossed the threshold like a drifting shadow, his deep brown eyes sweeping every corner, catching each faint human scent, every echo of Sophie's distant giggle from her room. Sarah had prepared everything for him. A warm bed by the kitchen, a bowl of fresh water, a generous meal more plentiful than anything he'd likely ever had before. She'd bought him a new dark brown collar, engraved with his name and Mark's phone number, a quiet promise that from now on, he had a place to belong. Mark kept his distance. He leaned against the kitchen counter, arms folded tight, eyes narrowed as he watched Max move cautiously, nose brushing the walls, the table legs, then stopping at Sophie's room. The door was ajar, just enough for Max to see Sophie sleeping in her crib, tiny hands reaching into her dreams. Max stood frozen at the doorway. His gaze was neither aggressive nor greedy. It was something far more unusual, as if he were silently swearing to himself to guard the fragile piece of the little human inside, even though no one had ever taught him how. When Sophie woke up, she babbled a word that made no sense to anyone but her. Ma. Reaching her tiny fingers through the crib bars for someone to hold her. Max only tilted his head, ears drooping, his long tail tracing a faint swirl in the polished wood floor. He didn't rush forward. He simply stayed close enough for Sophie to see him and break into a sparkling laugh, eyes catching the last strands of the afternoon sun streaming through the curtains. In the days that followed, Max became a silent shadow within the house. He never strayed far from Sophie. When Mark carried her outside to the yard, Max padded behind them, maintaining a respectful distance but keeping his ears locked on Sophie's every squeal. Sarah noticed that every time Sophie tripped over her own wobbly feet and cried, Max would stand in front of her, blocking out the world as if daring it to hurt her again. One stormy afternoon, thunder crashed so violently that Sophie wailed in fear. Sarah rushed to the kitchen for her bottle, only to return and find Max pressed right up against her crib, his head resting on the wooden rail, eyes sharp and protective through every crack of lightning. When thunder roared so loud it rattled the windows, Max didn't flinch or run. He let out a low growl, not at Sophie, but at the storm raging beyond the glass. To Sarah, that growl spoke louder than any vow a person could make. Max had claimed Sophie as his own to protect. Mark remained cautious. Every night he checked the locks 3 times, reminding Sarah they couldn't trust fairy tales about heroic dogs. But even he softened when he saw Max tolerate Sophie's curious fingers tugging his ears, patting his nose, or plopping her entire weight on his back without a single flinch of protest. One morning, Sophie was clumsily spoon-feeding herself oatmeal and dumped the whole bowl on the floor. Max didn't dive for it. Instead, he nudged Sophie's sticky hand with a gentle lick, then stepped back, waiting patiently for Mark to clean up. Hidden in the kitchen doorway, Sarah clutched a dish towel to her mouth, eyes stinging. Not out of frustration, but because she realized then, the affection Max gave Sophie was purer than any spoken promise people ever made. Night after night, Sarah often woke at 2:00 a.m. Sophie's restless hour. And each time, the first thing she saw was Max's eyes. He lay across the bedroom threshold, paws stretched out, head lifted just enough so his watchful gaze met hers. His eyes never glowed with threat, only with a calm resolve that said, "Go back to sleep, I'm awake for her." Summer in Asheville was damp and unyielding. On the stickiest nights, Max still lay there, his breath warming the floorboards. Once, Sarah caught him gently licking the hem of Sophie's pajama dress as she slept, only to pull back instantly, as if afraid to wake her from a dream. Who could have guessed that a dog once beaten into fear could hold so much tenderness for something so small and innocent? Sarah knew she had done the right thing bringing Max home. She trusted his eyes, trusted the quiet safety he wrapped around Sophie, until the night that trust was ripped apart, only to be proven in a way no one could have seen coming. That night, the sticky air clung to the ceiling of the Miller's bedroom, pressing down on Sarah's chest until she could barely breathe. She tossed and turned dozens of times, sleep hovering just out of reach. Beside her, Mark lay still, breathing evenly, the ceiling fan above them clacking in its lazy rhythm like an unwilling lullaby. In the corner of the room, Max was curled up on the rug at the foot of their bed. At first, he was as quiet as every other night, just a dark patch blending into the soft shadows cast by the nightlight. But sometime near 2 o'clock a.m., Max lifted his head, ears snapping upright, eyes flickering with an unease Sarah had never seen before. Half asleep, Sarah heard a low rasp deep in Max's throat. Then he stood abruptly, pacing the room, his paws thudding heavily on the wooden floor. Without warning, a hoarse bark burst out, tearing apart the suffocating quiet. Sarah jolted upright. Mark snapped awake too, but before he could ask anything, Max let out a deep growl and lunged at their bedroom door. His claws scraped harshly at the wood, scratching and thudding so loudly it made Sarah's skin crawl. A heartbeat later, he spun around and bolted straight for Sophie's room. There was no time to think. Sarah and Mark raced after him. Max slammed into Sophie's door with a force that swung it wide open. In the warm pool of the nightlight, Sophie lay asleep in her crib, one tiny hand curled around her favorite pink blanket. Max bounded forward, reared up against the crib rail, and gently clamped his massive jaws around the collar of her pajamas. Sarah screamed instinctively, "Max, no!" But he didn't stop. He swung around, Sophie squirming softly but unharmed in his grip, and charged out into the hallway, claws leaving streaks on the polished floor. Mark ran first, Sarah right behind him, her breath breaking in her throat. They watched, helpless, as Max barreled through the living room, nudged open the back door with his shoulder, and vanished into the thick, damp darkness outside. Panic squeezed Sarah's heart so tight she could barely think. "Oh God, Sophie! What is Max doing?" Barefoot, they dashed across the dew-drenched grass, feet slipping on wet blades. In the faint porch light, they saw him at last. Max had stopped beneath the biggest oak tree in the yard, the same old giant where Mark had promised to build Sophie a swing once she was big enough. Max gently lowered Sophie onto the soft ground beneath the sprawling roots, lowering his head close, breath fogging in the chilly night air. Sophie stirred, blinked drowsily, then let out a sleepy giggle, mumbling, "Ma!" as if nothing at all had happened. Sarah broke into sobs, stumbling forward to scoop her baby into her arms, clutching her so tightly that Sophie whimpered in protest. Mark knelt beside Max, one hand hovering over the dog's massive head, words caught in his throat. Max didn't look at him. His eyes were locked back toward the porch, the darkness swallowing the bushes and hedges around it. They didn't understand. Not yet. All they knew was that Sophie was safe in Sarah's arms, warm and whole. Mark helped Sarah up, one arm around her shoulders as they guided their sleepy daughter back toward the house. Behind them, Max remained at the base of the oak, a silent, motionless sentinel, his fur slick with dew, a faint tremor rippling along his spine. Back inside, Sarah sat on the edge of Sophie's bed, changing her into fresh pajamas, brushing away leaves stuck in her hair. Mark lingered by the open back door, peering into the yard one last time. That's when he froze. There, at the bottom of the porch steps, right where Max liked to nap and watch Sophie play during the day, the dirt was torn up, and stretched across it lay the limp, broken body of a copperhead snake, nearly 2 feet long, its belly slashed and head crushed. Mark swallowed hard, voice rough when he called out, "Sarah, come here, look." Sarah clutched Sophie tighter and stepped closer, peering past her husband's shoulder. The pieces fell into place so fast they made her knees go weak. Max had found the snake sneaking into the house. He had barked, growled, clawed at their door to wake them. When they didn't understand, he had done the only thing he knew. He charged into Sophie's room, grabbed her before the snake could strike, carried her out to safety, and then went back to finish what he started. Tears streamed down Sarah's face. Sophie tucked her head against her mother's neck, mumbling soft baby nonsense. "Ma, Ma," still calling for her guardian in the yard. Mark's hand trembled on Sarah's shoulder as he whispered, "I doubted him. I was so sure he'd hurt her. I never thought—" Sarah's eyes drifted past the porch light, searching the yard until they found Max's shape beneath the oak tree. He hadn't moved. He sat there in the grass, back to the house, watching the shadows that had hidden danger from human eyes. but not from his. Max had saved Sophie the only way he knew, with instinct and teeth and a loyalty no one had taught him to give. And now, Sarah realized with a jolt of dread, he was paying the price. In the grass, where Max lay, a dark patch spread slowly. Blood mingled with venom, seeping from the bite that had cost him nothing less than life itself. Sarah pressed her lips to Sophie's forehead, fighting back a sob. This night wasn't over. Max had saved her child. Now she would save him, no matter what it took. Sarah clutched Sophie so tightly her arms shook with each shaky breath. Mark stood by the back door, staring one last time at the dead snake before turning back, voice cracking. "Sarah, Max has been bitten. We need to get him to the vet. Now!" Sarah nodded, tears spilling freely into Sophie's soft hair. The baby squirmed against her chest, mumbling sleepily before drifting off again, blissfully unaware that her silent protector was dying under the old oak tree. Mark's eyes flicked from their sleeping child to the dark stain on the grass where Max lay. He drew a ragged breath, grabbed Sarah's shoulders. "I'll call the Parkers next door. They'll watch Sophie for us." Sarah didn't hesitate. Sophie needed to be safe. Max couldn't wait. She raced across the lawn, knocked hard on the Parkers' door until the porch light flicked on. Mr. and Mrs. Parker, the elderly couple who'd lived beside them for years, opened the door just as Sarah broke down. "Please watch Sophie for us. Max saved her, but he's been bitten by a copperhead. We need to get him help, now." Mr. Parker didn't ask questions. Mrs. Parker scooped Sophie gently into her arms, stroking her back. "Go, Sarah, save him. She's safe with us." Sarah nodded, no time for more words. She spun on her heel, bolted back across the yard, where Mark waited by Max. The dog lay under the oak, massive body shivering, fur around his front legs slick with blood and swollen tight. When Sarah knelt beside him, Max opened his eyes. Pain cloud, but still carrying that patient, unwavering glint she trusted so deeply. "Good boy, Max. You saved Sophie, now let us save you," Sarah whispered, her hand trembling as she brushed his ear. Mark backed the car up to the porch. Together they bent low, lifting Max's heavy body onto a thick blanket spread across the back seat. Max groaned softly, his head lolling into Sarah's lap as they maneuvered him in. The smell of wet fur and metallic blood clung to her sleeves. She didn't care. Mark slammed his door shut, tires squealing as he tore down the stone driveway. Sarah cradled Max's giant head against her chest, one hand bracing his limp neck, the other dialing the emergency vet. Her voice wavered but stayed firm. "We're coming in. Our dog's been bitten by a copperhead. He needs antivenom. Please be ready." 10 minutes. 15 minutes. Finally, the glowing sign of the 24-hour emergency vet flickered ahead like a fragile lighthouse in the darkness. Mark slammed on the brakes, leapt out, and yanked the back door open. Sarah almost tumbled out with Max, dragging him onto the driveway with every ounce of desperate strength left in her arms. A young vet tech sprinted out, one glance at the swelling and the unfocused eyes, and he barked out the order, "Snake bite, inside, now." They loaded Max onto a rolling stretcher. Sarah stood frozen in the doorway, clothes smeared with fur and dirt, sweat mixing with tears that wouldn't stop. Mark gripped her hand hard. "You did everything right. We did everything we could, Sarah." But Sarah didn't answer. In her mind, the scene replayed again and again. Max barking, growling, clawing at their door at 2 a.m., doing everything his animal heart knew to keep his little human safe. And now, as his life teetered on a razor's edge, there was only one thing Sarah could do: wait. The exam room doors swung shut, sealing Max behind a cold, white wall. Sarah leaned her head against Mark's shoulder, eyes squeezed shut, whispering a prayer for the bravest life she had ever dared to trust. Sarah sat hunched on a stiff plastic chair in the emergency hallway, her fingers twisted tight in the hem of her jacket, as if letting go would spill the last thread of hope she had left. Mark leaned against the wall beside her, glancing every so often through the frosted glass window into the treatment room. The hum of the air conditioner, the soft squeak of nurses' shoes on the cold tile floor, Everything blended into a tense symphony Sarah couldn't escape, no matter how hard she wished for silence. She had called Mrs. Parker just moments ago, her voice cracking as she managed only a whisper. "Sophie's safe. Thank you for keeping her for us." On the other end, Mrs. Parker's gentle words wrapped around her like a blanket. "Don't worry about Sophie, dear. She's sleeping peacefully. Focus on Max." Sarah buried her face in her palms. Visions of Max flashed through her mind, lying motionless under the oak tree, standing watch by Sophie's crib. That calm, gentle gaze. She owed him more than she could ever repay. Mark crouched down, his hand warm and steady on her shoulder. "He's strong, Sarah. He's going to pull through. Trust me." Sarah lifted her head, eyes swollen and red but holding a flicker of renewed faith. At the end of the hallway, the heavy treatment room door swung open just a crack. A figure in a white coat stepped out, eyes clear, voice calm. Sarah's heartbeat stuttered in her chest. The vet stepped out, pulling off his mask, his expression softening when he saw Sarah and Mark holding their breath. He nodded, his voice steady as a promise. "Max is stable now. We gave him the antivenom in time. He just needs rest and monitoring. He's one tough boy." Sarah broke down, tears spilling warm and fast down her chin. Mark wrapped his arm around her shoulders, exhaling like a man freed from the longest nightmare. In that moment, the stark white hallway became the most beautiful place in the world. They were allowed a few minutes with Max. Sarah tiptoed in, afraid to startle him. He lay stretched out on a soft pad, his leg wrapped snug in clean bandages, a small oxygen tube tucked beside his muzzle. Yet his eyes were open, groggy but searching for something familiar. When Max's gaze met Sarah's, his big tail thumped gently against the blanket. Just one slow wag, but it made Sarah laugh through her tears. She bent close, whispering, "Good boy, Max. Such a good boy." Mark stood beside her, resting his hand on Max's massive head, nodding once, a silent thank you for a loyalty he'd once feared, now cherished more than words could say. The next morning, as sunlight poured gold over their little street, Sarah sat in the car beside Mark, parked in front of the emergency vet. Max, though still breathing heavily, was stable enough for the vet to allow him home, back to the family he had protected with every ounce of life in him. The glass door slid open and a young nurse led Max out on a brand new leash. The big shepherd moved slowly, his leg wrapped in fresh white bandages, his muzzle damp with medicine. But the moment his eyes caught sight of Sarah and Mark, his heavy tail gave a faint wag and he dipped his big head in a slow, tired greeting. Sarah couldn't stop her tears. She bent down, pressing her face into his fur, her voice a trembling whisper. "Let's go home, my brave boy." The drive back felt brighter than any morning Sarah could remember. Mark drove carefully, stealing glances in the rearview mirror at Sarah, who kept stroking Max's head, murmuring a never-ending stream of gratitude. When they pulled into the driveway, Mrs. Parker was waiting at the gate. Sophie perched happily in her arms, clutching her ragged old teddy bear she never slept without. The moment Sophie spotted the car, she squirmed, arms reaching down toward the walkway. Mrs. Parker laughed softly and set her down on the warm stone path. Max, still weak and limping, perked his ears when Sophie's scent drifted his way. In an instant, his tail gave a slow, deliberate wag. Then, to everyone's surprise, Max let out a bark. Not loud, not strong like before, but hoarse and soft. To Sarah, it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. Sophie clapped her hands, squealing with delight, and toddled forward. Max settled onto his haunches, lowering his big head just in time for Sophie to fling her tiny arms around his thick neck. In that moment, Sarah knew. Her daughter might be too young to understand, but her heart had already carved deep the shape of a friend who didn't need armor or weapons, just loyalty. Mrs. Parker stood beside Mark, her hand resting on his shoulder as she murmured, "You really do have a living miracle in your yard." Mark squeezed Sarah's shoulder as she knelt beside Sophie and Max. He nodded slowly, voice warm and sure. Not just a miracle, a lesson we'll never forget. In the days that followed, word of Max saving Sophie spread quickly through the neighborhood. Neighbors brought casseroles for Sarah, new toys for Max. A local reporter even came to take a photo of the hero dog beside Sophie. But for Sarah, Max needed no title. It was enough to see him healthy again, curled up next to Sophie, letting out a tired, raspy bark every time she laughed. That was everything. That afternoon, out in the backyard, Sophie fell asleep with her head resting on Max's thick back. Sarah sat beside them, her hand gently stroking his fur, whispering in his ear, "Thank you for never leaving her, Max. And thank you for teaching me this. Real love doesn't need promises. It just stays, even when it costs everything." Years had passed since that fateful summer night. Sophie Miller was now a young girl on the cusp of womanhood, her hair brushing her shoulders, her smile still as bright as the morning sun of her childhood. One day, during a high school civics lesson on courage, when the teacher asked the class, "Who is your hero?" silence filled the room until Sophie stood up, her clear eyes shining, her voice steady with a pride that came from her heart. "I once had a hero. He didn't wear a cape, he couldn't speak, and he never needed applause. But he saved me from a venomous snake when I was only 18 months old. His name was Max, and he was the best friend I have ever had in my life." The classroom fell quiet. The teacher smiled, eyes glistening at the simple, heartfelt truth. In that moment, Sophie knew that no matter how many years passed, courage wasn't just printed on the pages of history. It lived inside her, shaped by the memory of a dog who chose love over fear. After class, Sophie pedaled her bike home and rolled to a stop in her familiar backyard. The old oak tree where Max had once stood guard through countless nights now spread its cooling shade across the soft green grass. Beneath its sturdy limbs sat a small headstone carved from dark granite, the letters still sharp and deep despite years of sun and rain. "Max, our silent hero, friend, protector, in the heart of our family, thank you for teaching us to love without fear." Sophie sank cross-legged onto the grass, tracing her fingertips over the carved words. A gentle breeze carried the scent of grass and damp wood, and in its hush, she closed her eyes and let her memories lead her back. She remembered lazy afternoons, her head resting on Max's broad back, her arms draped around his neck as she listened to the steady drum of his heartbeat like a lullaby. She remembered his gentle eyes, the slow thump of his lazy tail against the grass whenever she whispered childhood secrets into his ear. In those moments, the whole world felt safe. And she knew love needed no words at all. In Sophie's heart, Max remained just like that, not regal like a lion, not fierce like a hero from stories, but a quiet, constant friend, sitting beside her under the old oak, keeping her childhood safe, whole, and warm. And Sophie knew, no matter how much time might steal away, the memory of Max, the abandoned dog who chose to give his life for her, would stay forever. Like the oak tree's deep roots, like the soft breath of a childhood that would never truly fade,